welcome. It gives me tremendous pleasure to be in New Zealand and to share my story with so many of you tonight. Now I can see a lot of non-Muslims in the room. Just relax, I'm not Islam's answer to Billy Graham. I want to share the story with you so you can enjoy it, maybe understand a little bit more about Islam. The title of the story is From Kabul to Kaaba, but I want to take you back a few weeks before I entered Kabul. I want to take you back to September 11. I bet everyone in this room can remember exactly where they were, who they were with, what they were doing when they heard about September 11. The Muslims that I have spoken to who saw the horrific events unfold on television told me that at the moment of the second plane going into the Twin Towers and realizing it was a terrorist strike, their first reaction was, "Please God, don't let this be the work of Muslims." I was in my newsroom in Fleet Street in London when I noticed people gathering around the television sets that were there. And I shouted over to somebody at the Sunday Express and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Oh, there's been a terrible accident. There's a plane crashed into one of the Twin Towers in New York." And I went up and joined everybody else and watched the drama unfold. And then we saw the second plane going in. I've told you about the immediate reaction of Muslims. My immediate reaction was, this is a big, big story. It's bigger than the assassination of JFK, could even be bigger than man landing on the moon. I've got to get out to New York. My reaction was different to those of the Muslims, certainly. By the time I got to Heathrow Airport, the Twin Towers had imploded, the Pentagon had been hit, a plane had gone down in Pennsylvania. America was at war, it was under siege. Her airspace had been closed down, her borders had been sealed, and I physically couldn't get into the country. No matter which airline or which route I looked at, it was impossible. And so I hung round Heathrow in and out for the next 4 days. Finally, I got that ticket for the first flight out to New York. And as I was making my way to the departure lounge, my phone went and it was my boss, the news editor. He said, "There's been a change of plans. We want you to go to Pakistan." I was furious. The contacts that I had been making were in New York. My clothes that I had packed were for New York. I'd never been to Pakistan. I probably needed injections. You know, what is this country? Why do you want to send me there? This is a Middle Eastern thing. Why don't I go to the Middle East? And he said, "No, the story is going to unfold in Pakistan and neighboring Afghanistan." Within 12 hours, I arrived in Islamabad, dressed for New York, which went down very well, as you can imagine. And over the next few days, I started writing about people's hopes and fears for the impending war which was going to happen in neighboring Afghanistan, where the richest country in the world was going to bomb the poorest country in the world. By the end of the week, 3,000 journalists from around the world had joined me. They were in Peshawar, they were in Islamabad, and they were down in Quetta. Thousands of journalists from all over the world, from print, radio, TV, the internet, every form of communication you can imagine. I worked for a Sunday newspaper. I was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express, and I was trying to second guess what the news would be at the weekend. You get a chance to be more analytical, and I'm not a journalist who has ever been spoon-fed from governments. I don't trust them. And so I began to think that the best story was probably in Afghanistan. From the ordinary people, the ordinary Afghan people, I wanted to know what their expectations and fears were, what life was like for them living under the Taliban. We'd read a lot of news. According to Bush and Blair, the Taliban was the most evil, brutal regime in the world. They subjugated and oppressed women. They killed them randomly. The tales that were coming out were terrible. I distinctly remember Tony Blair saying, "These people are so evil, they won't even let their children fly kites." And so I decided, well, I need to find this out for myself. And I went to the Taliban embassy in Islamabad, and I tried 3 times to get a visa, and 3 times I was rejected. And so in the end, with my guides, I had got 2 or 3 guides who were helping me, I decided to sneak into Afghanistan. The idea was planted in my head by the BBC's chief correspondent, John Simpson, who had put on a burqa and put his toe into Afghanistan and said, "Hey, look, I've become invisible." And I thought, well, if the BBC's gargantuan correspondent can become invisible, then surely it will be easy for me. And so we devised a plan that we would be part of a wedding party. I would go in with 2 guides, one from the NWFP province in Pakistan, was born in Afghanistan. And we went in as a group. I put on the burqa. We drove through the Khyber Pass. That was another eye-opening experience. I imagined the Khyber Pass to be about 30 yards long. It was 33 miles long, winding, dramatic, mountainous roads, amazing scenery, traces of British imperialism everywhere. Suddenly I could hear my heart thump, thump, thump in my ears, and I'm beginning to think maybe this isn't such a good idea. I wanted to turn round and run away, but I'd gone beyond the point of no return. But it was as predicted. I had become invisible. I didn't even warrant a first look, never mind a second look, as we crossed the Taliban checkpoint. I was very tense, very excited. I was going to see firsthand what life was like in one of the major cities in Afghanistan, where women were oppressed and subjugated, according to Bush and Blair. When we pulled up at the marketplace, I was really surprised, because there, who was doing all the shopping? The men. You can't get Western men into supermarkets or to do the shopping, and there were all these men doing the shopping. I thought, well, this is a good sign. There were women around. They were all wearing the burqa, and they were in the company of their mahram, or male companion escort. I sat on the edge of the marketplace and watched. And there were lots of Taliban around, and people seemed very excited and very happy. They didn't seem as though they were about to be bombed by the most powerful nation in the world. People seemed relaxed, and I was quite surprised. Our party then went with provisions to a tiny village, not even the size of this hall. And we went into the village, and there was lots of tears and laughter, as one of their own had returned, and he brought with him his cousin from the NWFP, his wife, his children, and then they said, well, who's that? pointing at me, and he told them in Pashto. I didn't understand the language, but I could tell from the reaction that they were not at all happy. Why on earth have you brought a Westerner into our midst at a time of war? But within half an hour, the natural exuberance and hospitality and curiosity of the Afghan people overcame the villagers, and they started talking to me. The first was a young girl in her 20s, and I said, "What do you think about this impending war?" And she said, "I am so angry. I should be in a hospital by now, qualified as a doctor, ready to help my people, ready to save lives. People are going to be wounded in this war, and I could help and save them." And I said, "So what is your problem?" She said, "My training was stopped a couple of years ago. The Taliban closed down the training center and sent all the instructors home. And here I am now, back home, rotting away in this village when I should be helping my people." And I felt very sorry for her, and I could feel her frustration. Here was a young, ambitious girl, and her life seemed to have been put in limbo. Just then, her elder brother came in, and he, through the translator, started talking, and he also had been training to be a doctor at the very same medical school, and when it had closed down for financial reasons, he too had been sent home. So it wasn't just the girl who was being affected, her brother was as well. And as we were communicating with the help of the translator, an Afghan lady walked in, and she looked at me very carefully, and she put her hands on her hips, and she really looked me up and down. And then she said through the translator, "Have you any children?" And I said, "Yes, I have a daughter." She said, "Just one?" And I said, "Yes, just one." And she pushed me, very strong. I lost my balance and went the other way. And she said, "You English and American women, you are all so pathetic. All you can ever have is 1 or 2 children. Me, I can have 15. And when you run out of your boy soldiers, I will be producing more." Don't think that Afghan women are shy, retiring creatures. And I thought, well, if this is what the women are like, what on earth are the men like? And I said, "But aren't you afraid of America, of Americans? And I will get those pots and pans, and I will fight him back myself." And I thought she probably would. Then she said, "Look, I'm really sorry about this mishap. We're very sorry, but this mishap in New York, it has nothing to do with us." And she kept calling 9/11 a mishap. And I thought, you know, this is really provocative, this is so offensive, this is insulting. 6,000 plus people have died, that's what we thought at the time, and you're calling it a mishap? Nobody saw the dramatic images that we saw, which were played on our TVs every day, day in, day out, for more than 2-3 weeks, whipping up the anger and the hysteria and the fear, watching the towers being hit, the towers imploding. They didn't see any of that. But she said, "We're very sad. But what has this got to do with us? Why do the Americans want to bomb us? We didn't do that." And her argument had some logic to it. As the afternoon progressed, I could tell that people were getting more and more nervous by my presence in the village, and we took some photographs after some persuasion, and then we left. We thought we'll head back early. But by the time we got back to Torkham, the gates had closed, these great big metal gates, and we couldn't get through. Apparently Pakistan had sealed the border. They weren't letting anybody in or out. We stayed overnight, and the next morning we went back to the area of Torkham, and again the gates were closed. And I said to my guides, if I don't get back by a certain time, my news editor will raise the alarm and there will be all sorts of panic. And one of the guides said, well, we can go through a smuggling route. And my eyes lit up at this. I thought, this is very exciting. This will give me something to write about and add to the humanitarian report that I will be doing. And I said, great, okay. And I imagined that we'd be going through narrow mountain passes, and it would be really exciting because the border with Afghanistan is about 1,400 kilometers long, and there are said to be about 300, 400 smuggling routes. So you can imagine how porous the border is. And so we went to this area called Dower Barber. But there was nothing secretive about it. In fact, there was probably more people in Dower Barber than there are in this room tonight. There were camel traders, there were donkey traders, there were people selling refreshments, people selling carpets. There were Afghan families with all their goods packed into hand carts heading towards Pakistan, unable to bear facing yet another war in their country, wanting to get to the safety of Pakistan. And there were lots of young men striding over from Pakistan, looking for Taliban recruiting officers because they wanted to sign up and fight with the Taliban. By this time, the Afghan shoes I had been wearing were cutting into my feet and they were bleeding and sore. And I complained, and one of my guides said, well, we're only 10 minutes away from the border, but we can go by donkey. And he said, can you ride a donkey? And I thought, can I ride a donkey? You know, I can ride a horse, I can jump with a horse. Look at these donkeys, they're smaller. And I got on its back. Now, I don't know if it sensed that it had an infidel on its back or what, but it just bolted. And it tore through this area, and my feet were waving, my arms were waving, and as I moved forward to try and get hold of the reins just to stop it, the one piece of equipment that I had taken with me, a camera, slipped out of the folds of my burqa right into the passing view of a Taliban soldier. Now, I don't know whether the donkey stopped and threw me off, whether he stopped the donkey and pulled me off. What happened, I really can't remember. All I remember is hitting the ground at a great rate of speed and then picking myself up. And as I drew myself up, I looked straight into the face of this Taliban soldier. When I got back to London, some of my girlfriends said, what was going through your mind at that precise moment when you knew the game was up? And I said, well, for a nanosecond, and I said it was a nanosecond, I looked at this Taliban soldier and I thought, my goodness, you're gorgeous. He had the most amazing green emerald eyes, very high cheekbones, and a great big beard with a life of its own. Very, very striking. But as I say, it was a nanosecond. And then I thought, oh, I've been caught. So I took my camera off and I handed it to him. And then I closed my eyes, waiting to be shot in the head. And when I opened my eyes after a few seconds, he'd gone. He'd gone over to the man who hired the donkeys. He wanted to know who is in charge of this woman. And then he would get to the bottom of the camera. I was delighted. I thought, I can get away. He still doesn't realize that there's a Westerner under the burqa. And I turned and went to attach myself to another group to follow them over the border. And as I walked away, I looked behind, and by this time a crowd of about 100 men had surrounded my two guides, and the soldier was in the middle, and he's screaming and shouting and waving the camera at him. And I looked and I thought, I can't leave them behind. Although we had made an agreement that if things did go pear-shaped, none of us knew each other, I couldn't abandon them. And so I went back, and I tried to push my way through these very angry men, and they pushed me back. So in the end, I removed my burqa and said in a very loud voice, "Will somebody let me through?" You could have heard a pin drop. And then there was a parting like the Red Sea as I walked towards the handsome soldier, who by this time was looking really gormless because his jaw just dropped as he saw a Westerner, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, come towards him. And I thought, he is going to be so happy to have got his hands on a Westerner that he'll forget all about my two guides. And as I walked, I shot them a sideways glance, and I could see by the full horror on their face that just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they had. I had emerged. I went up to the soldier, demanded the return of my camera, and once he'd recovered, he got the three of us, and we were bundled into a vehicle and taken off in the direction of Jalalabad. During the journey, the driver and the Taliban soldier had a very fierce exchange, and they kept looking back at me and arguing and looking back, and suddenly the driver did an emergency stop. The soldier asked me to get out of the car. And then he took me to this raised piece of ground and asked me to stand on it from the way he was motioning. So I stood on this raised piece of ground, and then he went off. He went marching off to my left, and I thought, where's he gone? And I'm standing there, rigid with fear, daren't move on this little tiny hill. And I'm looking around, and then all I can see are stones and pebbles and rocks. And I thought, this is the stoning corner. I'm going to be stoned. He's gone off to get a crowd. He's probably gone off somewhere to say, hey, I've got a Westerner stoning in 10 minutes. So I'm standing there and I'm looking down, and all I could see was blood-red nail varnish coming up from my toes. I'd lost my socks and shoes in the melee, and I thought, oh no, see my toes, they'll probably chop them off one by one. So I tried to cover my toes as well. I mean, we can laugh about it now, but I really thought that the final minutes of my life were being played out in this godforsaken area. And as I looked around, they say that your life flashes before you. Mine didn't. I'm just thinking, how can I get out of this situation? And then I remembered my time as a Sunday school teacher, and there was a biblical scene where Jesus had said at a stoning, "Let him without sin cast the first stone." So I thought, right, I'm going to say that. Of course, it never occurred to me they wouldn't be able to understand me. But I thought, no, I'm going to say, okay then, bring it on, but let him without sin cast the first stone. And so I'm playing this out in my mind, and then I'm looking round, and I thought, no, there's probably some pious so-and-so at the back saying, that's me, and he'll start the stoning. The Taliban soldier returns, and he has with him a woman wearing a burqa. She comes up behind me and turns me around very briskly and starts to frisk me. And I thought, oh, they're not going to kill me. Well, not just yet. Anyway, they're trying to find out if I'm carrying any weapons. And isn't it strange that he's gone off to get a woman? You know, why wouldn't he just search me himself? Obviously showing more courtesy than British police. And so all the fear that I had felt and the terror just melted away with relief. And then I became very angry. Those men had made me feel as though I was going to die. So I pulled away from the Afghan woman and I swung round at these wretched men. And I was wearing, I want you to picture the scene, my burqa had gone, but I was wearing a shalwar kameez, the trousers and an orange dress down to the knees. And I swung round at these men, very angry, and I said, I am not carrying any weapons. And to emphasize this, I picked up the hem of my dress and said, look. And then they all turned round and ran as though the devil was snapping at their heels. I don't know if any of you have seen the Carry On film where the Scottish regiment lift up their kilts at the natives and they run off, but it was the same effect. Of course, this was highly inappropriate behavior for a woman in Afghanistan, as I was to find out. And the lady wearing the burqa swung me back round and whacked me across the face. She was in such a state of shock at this vulgar display. Anyway, having established that I'm not carrying any weapons, I was then bundled back into the car and driven off to Jalalabad. I was taken into the intelligence headquarters and introduced to the head of intelligence, who understood a little bit of English. I apologized for causing any inconvenience, and he asked me to write down my personal details and telephone contacts to prove that I was a journalist. After I had done that, he said, we are about to eat. You must have something to eat. And I said, well, that's very kind, but I need to use the telephone first. And he said, no, you can't use the phone. So I said, in that case, I won't eat either as a guest or a prisoner of the Taliban until I can use the phone. And what started then was a war of attrition, which was to last 10 days. Now, you would think that the most evil, brutal regime in the world couldn't care less if one of their prisoners had gone on hunger strike. But these men were very, very upset. Despite my protest saying I'm not eating, every morning, noon and night they would bring me food. They would lay out a cloth on the floor, beautiful carpeted floor, by the way, and they would put down some bread, some stew, and some rice, and they would bring in a jug of water and a bowl, and they would wash my hands, and they would tell me in broken English, you are our sister, you are our guest, we want you to be happy. And I thought, what sort of evil, brutal regime is this? Don't they understand the job description? And I'm thinking, you know, this is just a trick. They're trying to soften me up. And then the really bad guys will come in with the electrodes. In fact, isn't it strange? Everything that I thought would have happened to me under this so-called savage primitive regime happened to prisoners in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo Bay, and other US holding facilities, which always prompts me to say, thank God I was captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world and not by the Americans. By the third day, they called the doctor. Not that I was feeling unwell at all, but they called the doctor and he came, a little man who trained in Germany, and he looked in my eyes, my ear, took my pulse, looked in my mouth, and I thought, they do this, don't they, on death row in Texas just before they're going to execute somebody. They like to make sure that they're fit and healthy. And then he took my blood pressure, and something bothered him because he then took it again. And I said, yes, I know I have high blood pressure. And he said, no, you don't. Your blood pressure is normal. I said, don't be so ridiculous. It can't be normal. You know, I'm about to be killed by the Taliban. How on earth is my blood pressure normal? And he said, look, and he did it again. And it was normal. I said, there you are, 3 days with the Taliban, and you've cured my blood pressure. Thank you very much. During those 6 days in Jalalabad, a procession of very scary, fierce-looking men came into the room, and I had decided on quite a risky strategy, really. I had decided to be the prisoner from hell. I had bought into the propaganda, you see, that this was the most evil, brutal regime in the world, and it didn't matter what I said or did, they were going to kill me at the end of the day. Abusive and aggressive. And the harder I pushed them, the nicer they were. Hamid had to translate my words. And one day he said to me, I am terrified of these people, and you should be as well. And it's not nice for me to translate your words. I get scared. On the 6th day, Hamid came to see me, and his face was nearly black with fear. His mouth was so dry he could hardly talk. And he said, you have a very important visitor. And I said, who is it? He said, I can't tell you, but you must be respectful. I said, well, who is it? Is it Mullah Omar? And he said, please, just be respectful. You have to show some respect. This is a very, very important person. So I'm thinking, I wonder who it can be. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Although I was the prisoner, I had my own key. And so I unlocked the door, opened it, Hamid stood aside, and there in front of me was a man who made my blood run cold. The hair on the back of my neck lifted. For 6 days I had avoided talking about religion, and there in front of me was a religious cleric, a Maulana. And everything in Afghanistan is dirty, ripped and torn and dusty. He was wearing an immaculate ivory gown, one which went right down to the ground. The Taliban's clothes were above their ankles. This guy's clothes were right down to the ground. You couldn't see his feet. And he had a great big ivory turban. A very modest beard by Afghan standards. Very light brown, modest beard. And light brown eyes. And he had beads which he moved, like rosary beads, which he moved 2 at a time. And there was something else about him that I thought was weird. And when I mentioned it to my first Muslim crowd, a few of them went, Alhamdulillah. When I told them, I said there was something really weird about this guy. He had a shine on his face. It was like a light on the inside coming out. I've never seen anything like it before. And I was told by my Muslim friends back in London, this is the nur, the light that comes out of somebody who is very pious, very practicing, a very good person. I didn't know that at the time. I just thought there's something weird and spooky about this guy. After I recovered, I moved aside and invited him into my room. And he was so graceful and elegant, he didn't even seem to walk. He just glided in and glided down. And I sat opposite him, and Hamid acted as the translator. And he said, what is your religion? And I thought, oh, here we go. I said, I'm a Christian. He said, yes, but what sort of Christian? Are you a Roman Catholic? Are you a Protestant? I said, I'm a Protestant from the Church of England. And he's smiling and moving his beads, and he said, and what do you think of Islam? Oh, I said, it's fantastic. It's absolutely wonderful. Of course, I knew nothing about Islam, very little, and the little that I knew was totally wrong as it turned out. And I went off in praise for 2 minutes of this faith that I knew so little about. And he smiled and he moved his beads, and then when I finally stopped running out of adjectives, he said, Islam is a beautiful religion. I couldn't agree more. And then again, I ran off in praise of Islam. And he smiled as he listened, and Hamid translated. And I said, do you know, the people around here are so passionate about their faith that they pray 5 times a day. I know because I've watched and counted it. And he looked. He must have thought, you stupid woman, but I didn't realize that Muslims are expected to pray 5 times a day. So he moved his beads, and then he said, so, you would like to convert? And I thought, he's led me into a blind alley here. If I say, yes, I'll convert, he'll accuse me of being fickle and insincere, and he'll say, take her away and have her stoned. If I say, no, I'm not interested, he'll say, how dare you insult Islam, take her away and have her stoned. So I'm trying to come up with the right answer. And then, in the end, I said, look, I can't make such a life-changing decision while I'm in prison, but if you let me go, I promise I will read the Quran and I will study Islam. And he smiled, and he didn't say anything more, and he rose up and he glided out. Hamid went scuttling after him, and he returned a few minutes later, and he said, you're going home on a red crescent plane.